Hey guys, Collin Chi, certified nutritional consultant, numerologer, bringing you another talk today. Today I'm going to talk about a very important book in astrology. This book is basically scientifically validating and statistically validating astrology. This is going to be one of the few videos out there where you find experiment after experiment, experiments from the 60s, 70s, 40s, 30s, 20s, so many experiments on the effect that the moon, the planets, the sun has on humans, on animals, on chemicals, on water even. I'm going to be going through this most important book and throw out the possibility of the scientific and statistical validation of astrology. Can you believe it? Let me before I show you this book, let me read something from it real quick to hook you into this talk, all right? So here we go. Oysters and the moon's time. Brown had some live oysters sent in closed, darkened containers from Long Island Sound to his laboratory in Evanston, 1,000 miles from the sea. When they arrived, he observed their activity by measuring the opening of their valves. At first, the oysters kept to their natural rhythm, opening and closing themselves to the rhythm of the tides washing Long Island Sound. But after about 15 days, Brown noticed that a slippage in the daily rhythm had occurred. The oysters now opened up at the time the tide would have flooded Evanston, had the town been on the seashore. That is when the moon passed over the local meridian. The oysters had abandoned their rhythm tide to actual tides and responded to an exclusively lunar rhythm. They were reset by an unknown influence related to the passage of the moon above the meridian of Evanston. All this while they were shielded in the dark tanks of the laboratory. So basically the oysters that he took from Long Island in a darkened container he took to Evanston, and their metabolic and biological rhythms were still going at the rate of that area where they were taken from. And then after a couple weeks, they started to adapting to what the moon was doing in the area where they were taken. They were not in the tide in their natural habitat, natural environment, yet they started to regulate their metabolic activity to the moon, basically, because the environment was completely controlled in this experiment. So this book is experiment after experiment on all kinds of stuff. I'm going to go through it. Here it is. Michel Gauqelin. I'm not French, so I don't know if that's how you pronounce it. The Cosmic Clocks. This is a French guy that graduated from the Sorbonne, which is one of the most prestigious universities in Paris. Very smart guy, okay? This book was originally published in 1969, I believe in England or somewhere like that first. So it goes through the history of astrology as well as experiment after experiment, okay? So let's get into it. I hope that hooked you with that. We're going to go through, he's got a whole chronology of, of the history of astrology, so pretty interesting. So we're going to go through the history of astrology. We're going to go through all these awesome experiments. This is going to be a long talk because this information is not out there. This is a very important book for mankind's understanding of astrology, okay? So here we go, all right? Let's jump into it. 25,000 to 10,000 BC, the notches on the bones of reindeer and the tusks of mammoths represent the phases of the moon. Okay, they found these tusks and these bones with notches in them that were representing the phases of the moon. 700 to 400 BC, discovery and description of the zodiac by the Babylonians. 6th century BC, doctrine of the harmony of the spheres by Pythagoras in Greece. 331 BC, conquest of Chaldea by Alexander the Great. Chaldea is in basically Babylon in the same area in Mesopotamia, ancient Mesopotamia, which is modern-day Iraq, basically. 70 BC, the first Greek horoscopes, which take into account the precise hour of birth. 4th century A.D., St. Augustine criticizes astrology in the name of the Christian faith in his Confessions. And then Christianity reigns for many, many years. And then you have the Dark Ages. The official condemnation of astrology by Colbert, minister of Louis I don't know what that is, 18th or something in France. Astrology is banished from the Academy of Sciences and from the university. A.D. 1898, the scholarly Swede Svante Arrhenius, winner of the Nobel Prize in Physics, undertakes the first statistical work on the influence of the moon on the weather and on living beings. I'm almost done with this, and then I'll go into all the other stuff. A.L. Chajevsky, statistical work on the role of sunspots on human life. So we're going to be going through a number of these things and getting into all the details of these experiments and things, okay? Sunspots and their activity on human life. AD 1922, memorandum from Doctors Faure and Sardou to the Academy of Sciences concerning the influences of sunspots on sudden illnesses. AD 1941, the Japanese Maki Takada demonstrates the role of an unknown solar ray on human blood serum. AD 1948, actually let's skip that one. AD 1950 to 1955, publication by scientists of statistics demonstrating the falsity of horoscopes. So that's an important one because there's only a few showing the falsity. Most of these are about the undeniable influence of the planets on the sun and the sun on the earth and the moon on the earth and all this stuff. So I'm paraphrasing this chronology here. I'm only picking out certain ones, and then we're going to go into all this stuff. AD 1957, satellites are launched into space and demonstrate many hitherto unknown interactions between the bodies of the solar system. AD 1960, two more here. First studies indicating a correlation between planets and heredity revealed. Okay? Heredity, DNA. AD 1963, survey by the French Institute of Public Opinion reveals that despite the efforts of scientists, 43% of the population still believes that astrology is a true science. Okay? So we're going to go into all this awesome stuff. It's amazing, all right? Who knew there were so many experiments? Okay, the oldest religion. Astrology is the oldest religion. It's the oldest science. Where did astrology originate? The answer is everywhere on Earth. When did it begin? It has existed as long as man has. In fact, even longer. When the sun goes into eclipse, animals become restless and anxious. They seem to fear an imminent danger. Birds cease to sing and apes leave their trees, banding together for safety, keeping silence. Okay, that's the first paragraph. Okay, I'm going to be jumping around and picking out certain parts here. This is going to be, 45-minute to an hour talk. I'm not going to read everything in this book, of course. That would take forever. Next thing. Okay, so it originated everywhere. At the dawn of man, the beginning of man, it's been around since we know of man. Alexander Marshak, writing in the 6th November 1964 issue of Science, contends that nicks cut in certain reindeer bones, there's the reindeer bones, and mammoth ivory in the Upper Paleolithic period represent notations of lunar sequences. Thus, some 10,000 to 25,000 years ago, man may have been observing and reporting the cycles of the moon. The two main kinds of concerns our ancestors felt when they looked up to the skies, scientific and religious. Those are the two main concerns. The world, whether friendly or hostile, was always indispensable. Okay, they couldn't dispense of nature, like we can. They can't control nature. They couldn't control nature to the degree that we can now. So primitive man knew he had to control it somehow. In order to do this, he could try two things, to worship it or to know it. Astrology was born as a way of combining these two attempts to establish some measure of control over the world. It is no exaggeration to say, as most historians do, that astrology was at the same time the first religion and the first science man developed. Okay. The sun, the moon, the stars, all celestial bodies became objects of worship, of fear, of hope. Their influence seemed to affect not only the fate of men, but also the future of the world. This syncretistic belief, which naively expresses the ceaseless interaction between the cosmos and terrestrial life, is found among all primitive peoples. Okay? It's in a lot of the religions, Islam, Indian religions, Chinese philosophy. You know, there's concepts of watching the skies, you know, and you know, the planets were gods to these people. Okay, moving on. So the priests in... Okay, so here we have, thus was astrology born 5,000 years ago in Chaldea. Okay, Chaldea is ancient Mesopotamia. It's modern-day Iraq. Okay, it's Babylonia. It's Babylon. It's Sumeria. They're all right in the same area of ancient Mesopotamia, which is basically modern-day Iraq. Okay, and between Iraq and the Arabian Desert, I believe. So Chaldea was a small area right amongst those. Okay, Babylon's up here. I think Sumer's here, and then Chaldea's here on the map. So, interesting to note that the Tower of Babel was in Babylon, because Babel was Babylon's ancient name. Interesting. Okay, the heavenly signs. On today's map, here we go. On today's map, Chaldea would occupy approximately the area of Iraq. Many civilizations have succeeded each other in this part of the world. Okay, so the Chaldeans worshipped three main gods initially. The moon god, which was called Sin, who was masculine and the most powerful to them. So interesting. I think Vedic astrology puts more emphasis on the moon than Western astrology. So it seems that these guys put emphasis on the moon here, even more than the sun. And then Shamash, the sun god, feminine, and Ishtar, the goddess of love, which was Venus, was Ishtar, I believe. So they worshiped Venus, the sun, and the moon. Those were the three main initial planets that they were interested in, I guess. Okay, so then the Chaldean priests, which were actually astrologers and astronomers, they are the ones that mediated between the astronomy. You know, people don't realize that astrology really at the end of the day is astronomy. There's a lot of astronomy in astrology, okay? So they were the ones that were mediating and trying to read, you know, the signs. You know, if you see something, let's say, you know, a king dies or something, you know, and the planets are in a particular position, the moon, and it's charted right then and there, you know. You can possibly try to predict in the future when that same arrangement occurs again, that another king will die or something like that. That's getting pretty specific, but this is what they attempted to do to gain control over their universe and their world, because this was the way they knew how, because all they had to do was look up at the skies. You know, so they built these giant observatories up to 270 feet high in Chaldea, the priests, to chart and watch the skies in order to, you know, help guide the king and the and whoever about crops and about all kinds of things. So moving on, a space between. So they sectioned out the sky into three sections. One section was Anu, the other was Enlil, and the other was Ea. And in the middle was Anu, and that's where the sun and the planets continually, you know, went along that path every day. So, and they still do. Okay, so Anu's path. Okay, so this was a space 16 degrees wide, which contains the constantly repeated path of the sun, the moon, and the planets. Interesting. And don't worry, I'm going to get into all these experiments because it's amazing stuff. I'm trying to breeze through this history here. But hopefully you'll find it interesting because there's not too many videos about the history of astrology. So, the zodiacal belt with its constellations was known in Babylonia as early as 700 BC. The first tablet of the series, Mulapin, lists the constellations in the path of the moon as follows. Okay, these were the original constellations that they listed. Okay, the hairbrush, which was Pleiades, the bull of Anu, which was Taurus, Anu's true shepherd, Orion, the old man, Perseus, sickle sword, Auriga, the great twins, Gemini, Procyon or Cancer, lion or lioness was Leo, Furrow equals Spica, which is Virgo, the scales equals Libra, Scorpion or Scorpio, Archer, Sagittarius, Goatfish, Capricornus, Great Star or Giant, Aquarius, the tails, Pisces, the Great Swallow, Pegasi, the goddess Anunitum, Pisces, plus middle part of Andromedes, the hireling, equals Aries. So there were like 18 constellations originally. Then in 419 BC, they came up with the main 12 here, okay? It was Aries, Pleiades, Gemini, Praesepe, Leo, Spica, Libra, Scorpio, Sagittarius, Capricornus, Aquarius, and Pisces. Okay, but the Greeks, when the Greeks took over astrology, because the Greeks conquered Chaldea in 331 BC, and then they assimilated astrology into their culture when they conquered Chaldea. Then the Romans conquered the Greeks, and they assimilated astrology into their culture, and astrology went through some additions. You know, the Greeks and the Romans added some things to astrology and perfected it and codified it and made it even better. So the Greeks substituted Taurus, Cancer, and Virgo for Pleiades, Praesepe, and Spica, or Furrow. You know, Virgo was initially related to the harvest. They also called it Furrow or Spica. So that's kind of interesting to know that Taurus used to be called Pleiades, Cancer used to be called Praesepe, and Virgo used to be called Spica or Furrow. Interesting. Probably didn't know that. Okay, let's move on here. I have to say this for my brothers because I think it's interesting. The Chaldeans held Mercury, which is the planet that rules Virgo, which is what I am. The Chaldeans held it to be the dwelling of Nebo, a god who was untrustworthy, shy, shrewd, and voluble. The planet Mars, which is Aries, became the home of Nergal. Nergal, the dangerous, evil, and violent god of war, etc., etc. I just had to throw that in for my brothers. I hope you watch this someday. Moving on. I think that's funny. Nebabo. Okay, so as the history of horoscopes begins, that of Chaldean astrology, which started in the 3rd millennium BC with predictions of the weather, of the success of crops, of the fate of the country as a whole, draws to a close. Later it involved foretelling the destiny of kings with the conquest of Chaldea by the Greek warriors of Alexander the Great in 331 BC. The Greeks made astrology more individual and personal. They personalized it. They came up with the first horoscopes that included the actual birth date of people. It advanced the prediction of individual futures. This was the astrology the Greeks took over and transformed through their unique genius into a body of knowledge both elaborate and precise. They built astrology and horoscope making into a form almost identical to that in which they are practiced today. Then you have the Harmony of the Spheres by Pythagoras of Samos. Pythagoras is the main dude attributed to numerology as well. He was also an astrologer, an astronomer, and many things. He was a philosopher, teacher. So you have the harmony of the spheres, 6th century BC. He was a Greek, okay? Still holds a mysterious power over the depths of the unconscious. The Pythagorean universe was a sphere containing the earth and the air around it. Okay, the swift revolution of each of these bodies, okay, this is the harmony of the spheres. This is what it means. The swift revolution of each of these bodies, they're talking about the planets, causes a swish or musical hum in the air. Evidently, each planet will hum on a different pitch depending on the ratios of their respective orbits. Just as the tone of a string depends on its length, thus the orbits in which the planets move form a kind of huge lyre. A lyre is an ancient instrument. I believe it's kind of like a harp, whose strings are curved into circles. Interesting. So, we all think about, everybody has a vibration, right? You can sense somebody's vibe that they're giving off. I don't like that guy's vibe. He's just got bad vibes or whatever. Everything truly does have a vibration because everything has an electromagnetic frequency that it's giving off. Everything exudes magnetism. So that is the same as saying everything has a vibration, or everything is vibration, or everything is music, or everything is numbers. Those are true statements. Those are all true statements. We can't see the vibrations. We can measure them with instruments. We just don't have these senses yet. We do. We're just slightly unaware of them. Probably due to pineal calcification or other things. Many, many things. Bad nutrition, bad psychology, bad conditioning, etc. But everything is a vibration. So Pythagoras meant that the planets are giving off a vibration also. And we'll get to the part where, yes, those vibrations are so far away, right? So how could they possibly affect us down here on Earth? They're so far away. Well, just wait, folks. We have a lot to say about that, okay? They're called magnetospheric tails. Up to 20, I think it's 20 times the distance from the Earth to the Moon. Some people have charted and scientifically shown that planets have these, and the Earth has a magnetospheric tail that is up to 20 times that length. Very vast distances, okay? That the magnetism, there's a magnetosphere, that is very affected by the planets and the sun and the moon. Okay, so Alexander's conquest of Chaldea in 331 BC. Conquered Chaldeans imposed their astrological views on the conquering Greeks. Moving on. Astrology in Rome. Okay, everybody, it was the height of refinement for emperors to have their astrology read at time of conception and also at time of birth. So there's an interesting difference in the evolution of astrology that some people thought it interesting to look at your astrology at the time you were actually conceived in the womb, not the time you were actually born, but both. I think I would be a Sagittarius if that were the case, which makes sense because my midheaven is Sagittarius, and I do have a good amount of fire in me. So the emperors, the Romans, they pretty much all believed in most of them believed in astrology, but the attempt had no success. The disorganized and weakened empire was soon to disappear under the barbarian waves pouring in from the north and the east. The barbarians came in, conquered Rome, as far as I know anyway, or maybe it was also the Roman Empire was just, dying, and then the barbarians came in and completed that process. The disappearance of the Roman Empire signaled the triumph of Christian faith over the faith of astrology. So then you have Christian faith. St. Augustine was a big influence on this. And then you have the Dark Ages for many, many years. Then you have the Renaissance that comes, and the rebirth of astrology. The forecast of an astrologer today seems almost identical with the one a Greek or Roman astrologer could have given 2,000 years ago. The Greek word horoskopos literally means, I watch that which is rising. Originally, the word was not used to refer to the whole planetary pattern at the moment of birth, as it is today, but only to the point of the zodiac rising over the horizon at the exact moment of birth. The idea is that at birth, the infant is submitted to the influence of the constellation that is also being born. So it would seem that they put an emphasis on the rising sign, I guess. The rising constellation that was on the horizon rising at the time of their birth, I guess, would be what originally. But then, the Greeks, did a lot more to it. So to astrology and so anyway, it was a Greek idea to invent, not invent, but to add aspects, astrological aspects in houses. Those were Greek ideas that weren't originally part of a Chaldean astrology. So that's pretty interesting. It's also interesting to note that some of the most well-known astronomers were very much into astrology. Newton, Kepler, many people. Kepler had faith in astrology, even if a limited one. Kepler, it says here, it would not be an exaggeration to say that his belief in the occult contributed strongly to making him one of the founders of modern astronomy. He devoted all his life to proving the Pythagorean thesis of the harmony of the spheres. Okay, this is a guy that really laid all the foundation down of the laws of planetary motion. Johannes Kepler. Okay. Paracelsus, practiced medicine. Swiss physician mentions that he's the one that attributes certain organs to astrology in 1493 to 1541 is when he lived. Newton said that he attended Cambridge. The reason he attended Cambridge University was to find out what was true in astrology. Interesting. This is the guy Newton's known for for gravity. The laws of gravity he laid down. Astral psychoanalysis. They're talking about C.G. Jung, Carl Jung. Interesting. Carl Jung came up with the archetypes, and Carl Jung was very much into astrology. Let's see what else. Determinism, the denial of chance. It's kind of thought that chance does not exist for the astrologer either, it says. The stars determine every round of our lives up to the second of our death. Okay, that's the more extreme view. But it's pretty interesting. Okay. Dun, dun, dun. This is interesting. The Prince, this is an interesting psychological kind of perspective. The principal reason which turns some men to astrology and other superstitions is that they lack the necessary resources to solve the serious problems with which they are faced. Frustrated, they give in to the pleasant suggestion that there is a golden key within their reach, a simple solution, and ever-present help in times of trouble. We're talking about astrology. Faith in astrology today is therefore the symptom of a social and psychological disorder. A grave symptom. Man is looking for something. Progress has failed to provide so far. Okay, astrology, people have the tendency to look to the stars for answers when they're in deep times of trouble and confusion. Yeah, that's true. However, just wait. We're going to blow the lid off all the science in a minute here. We're almost there. Okay, now is the chapter on the scientific process. We're about 1/3 of the way through this book, or a little bit more than that. Okay, we're going to get going here. So, divining versus prediction is an interesting distinction to make. let's see what it says here. In every method of telling the future save astrology, divination is a divine revelation, a kind of extension of the human intellect. Astrology, on the other hand, began to break off from the religious attitude which created it, and instead of divining it, pretended to predict, and in so doing usurped the prestigious first rank among the natural sciences. Okay. In astrology, the cause is the horoscope, a momentary configuration of celestial bodies. The effect is the fate of the person to whom the horoscope applies. The implications of such a deterministic view were explored by an astronomer. Okay, determinism. Let's see. Chaldeans represented Capricorn as a goat with the lower body of a fish. This symbol is still used, although the emphasis is almost entirely on the goat. In India and China, on the other hand, Capricorn is represented by a bear and a unicorn, respectively. Okay. Then you have this French astrologer. French astrologer Paul Choisnard deserves more attention since he attempted to prove the myth of astrology more systematically through statistics. Okay. Let's see. He claimed, for instance, that there is obvious proof that people die under particular celestial configurations. After studying 200 cases, he concluded that when death occurred, Mars was 3 times and Saturn twice as often in conjunction with the Sun in the position of the person's birth than at any other period. Okay, so we're starting to get into the science of it, all right? Scientific process is this chapter, okay? Interesting. People die, more likely to die when Mars was 3 times and Saturn twice as often in conjunction with the Sun, okay, in the position of the person's birth than at any other period. Interesting. So when Mars is conjunct your Sun or Saturn is conjunct your Sun, be careful, be conscious, be wise. Okay? Here we go. Now we're getting into the chapter, all right? Part 2. This is when the book really turns. So if you read this book, you need to make it to part 2 because the first part is almost like being very skeptical of astrology and laying down the historical process of astrology. Because there's a lot of mentions about, how astrology's bull in the first part. And in the second part, it takes a completely different tone with all straight-up validation through science and stuff. Okay? Weather forecasting. This is the chapter. The prediction of weather is the first field in which science has replaced astrological prediction. Meteorology. Okay? Now it's going to get to the good stuff. It has been found that the moon's position in relation to the sun affects the Earth's daily magnetic index, Scholz wrote in 1941. Arrhenius and also later Schuster established that a considerably greater number of thunderstorms occur during the waxing phase of the moon than during the waning phase. Okay, so the sun affects the Earth's daily magnetic index. Here we go. The heaviest rainfall. Okay, 2 Australian researchers, E. Adderley and E.G. Bowen, of the Radiophysics Division in Sydney, have duplicated these findings in the Southern Hemisphere. Okay, they're talking about rainfall. The heaviest rainfall observed by 50 weather stations in New Zealand from 1901 to 1925, plotted in the same way as the U.S. data, was observed to occur during the days immediately following the new and the full moon. Okay? Heavier rainfall at the new and the full moon. Interesting. Explosions on the solar surface. Okay, the role of solar activity. Now we're moving into the sun. We're going to talk a lot more about the moon, though. Don't worry. Explosions on the solar surface interfere with the atmospheric electricity of our planet, cause fade out in radio reception, and account for geomagnetic storms. Okay. These passages depend on variations of barometric pressure, which change the direction of winds. If the pressure rises, the weather will probably improve. This is called an anticyclone. If the pressure descends, it is likely that it will rain. This condition is called a cyclone. It seems that the rise or decline in barometric pressure ultimately depends on the sudden eruptions in the sun. Mustel, the president of the Astronomical Council of the USSR's Academy of Sciences, has collected abundant documentation to show that when the solar surface is active, there is a tendency for anticyclones to develop above the land masses and for cyclones to form over the oceans. The study of tree rings is called dendrochronology. But the rings are not the same regardless of conditions. A warm and wet year leaves a wide ring, while a narrow ring is left by a cold and dry season. Okay? Followed very closely the rhythm of solar activity. The trees followed very closely the rhythm of solar activity. 1840, Schwab. The rings of trees all around the world are wider when the number of sunspots increases. Okay? This is statistical analysis. The rains fall more abundantly during periods of intense solar activity than during periods in which the sun is quiet. Okay, more rainfall with more solar activity. You know, sunspots. A lot of explosions happening on the sun constantly. That's what sunspots are. They're giant explosions happening on the sun. And there's all kinds of effects from those, okay? French Astronomical Bulletin, according to the French Astronomical Bulletin, years in which the number of sunspots is highest are great vintage years for Burgundy wines. In years with few sunspots, poor vintages are produced. Okay, because more rainfall, better weather for grapes. The waters rose when the sun was active, but declined when the sun was quiet. I wonder if there was a lot of solar activity at some point on the Earth that possibly caused the Great Flood, or the many great floods that possibly happened. There's a lot of scientific validation for big floods that happened on the Earth. The Swiss astronomer, dating the past, a solar hand ticks off the centuries. The Swiss astronomer Wolf has discovered pulsations of a much larger amplitude, which are called secular rhythms. Because they lasted almost a century, between 80 and 90 years, for about 40 years the sun's activity increases, the 11-year peaks growing higher and higher. Then the general activity decreases during the next 40 years, only to begin growing again. These secular rhythms of the sun are reflected not only in the thickness of the varves, but in other meteorological phenomena. Varves are like thin layers of mud laid down year by year by the weather and the rain and just natural process. Okay, so the sun has a rhythm, just like everything in nature is a frequency, including the sun. The sun is about an 80 to 90 year rhythm, okay? It's like, 1 or 2 heartbeats. If the sun is a heart, it's like, boom, 1 beat per 80 years, basically. It's crazy. Or per 40 years, I guess. So 40 years, the sun's activity increases dramatically increasing. In 11-year cycles, it increases more and more, and then goes down for 40 years. The sun's activity decreases for 40 years. This is the rhythm that the sun goes through. Like everything in nature is a vibration, including the sun has its vibration, okay? Solar activity. During the first 40 years from 1870 to 1910, the snowdrops, they're talking about flowers, consistently appeared before the average date, but after 1910 they began to flower later and later, attaining the greatest lag in 1925, almost 2 months behind the average date. The snowdrops began to reverse this lag until now they are again slightly early. Okay, they follow the solar rhythm. Soviet scientist I don't know how you pronounce it, Zhezia, studied the frequency of typhoons in southwest China using the data from the Observatory of Shanghai. He found an almost perfect similarity between the number of typhoons and the curve of solar activity in the years 1900 to 1950. Don't worry, these studies get amazing as we go on. The frequency of typhoons increased with the solar activity, attaining its peak between 1920 and 1930. The 90-year solar rhythms also seem to indicate the time of severe earthquakes. Okay, they're talking about, this is called the cosmic clocks because the planets and the Earth and our own bodies seem to have these biological clocks in them, or they're external to us, and we can somehow sense, and everything is timing in nature. The planets and radio reception. In 1951, John H. Nelson, propagation analyst at RCA Communications, was put in charge of a study involving the quality of the reception of radio broadcasts. It had been known for some time that the quality of reception depends on sunspot activity, and especially on the passage of the larger spots across the meridian. Okay, don't worry, we're going to get to the human being in a minute. Okay, but this is showing you that these planets have a definite effect on many, many things on this planet. The sun, the moon. Okay, there's the seasons for a reason. According to Nelson, certain specific planetary configurations cause disturbances in radio reception, those in which, in relation to the sun, the planets find themselves either at right angles to each other or in conjunction or in opposition. Venus, Jupiter, and Saturn are the source of powerful radio waves received by the Earth. It has been demonstrated that the planets affect the sun. One must admit the possibility that they may affect the Earth, which is closer to them than the sun is. The strange effects of the moon and of the planets may be due to the extremely long wakes they leave behind them. Okay, these are the magnetospheric tails. In 1964, A.T. Dessler calculated that the length of the Earth's magnetospheric tail was at least 20 times the distance between the Earth and the moon, just like I said. According to Bowen, the magnetospheric tails of other planets extend the same distance in space. The Earth has a clock. Mysterious rhythms. A classification of rhythms. The daily rhythm, which depends on the Earth's turning on itself every 24 hours, the monthly rhythm of the moon's turning around the Earth, and the yearly rhythm of the Earth's turning around the sun. These are the three basic time givers of life. Now, this is interesting, okay? Now we're getting into insects and animals and stuff, okay? D. Lees of Cambridge, Professor Anthony D. Lees of Cambridge, has observed that when daylight lasts longer than 14 hours and 55 minutes, the offspring is born alive. Okay, they're talking about bean aphids. If the day is shorter, the aphids are insects. They're little tiny insects. If the day is shorter by even a few minutes, the offspring is born inside an egg that will hatch later. As opposed to being born alive, a few minutes difference, it's born as an egg. Okay, inside the female bean aphid's body is an extremely delicate clock that works as a mathematical time memory of infinite precision. Okay, it's showing the highly sensitive, the high sensitivity that these insects even have to daylight. If it's a little bit longer, a little bit shorter, the offspring is going to be born as an egg versus a live baby. Interesting. Very sensitive. Okay. It was shown by Buning, another experimenter of some sort, that if one keeps dry grain seed in a container at uniform temperature and then extracts samples from time to time, the percentage of seed that will germinate depends on the season of the year. This is astonishing because the seeds are very dry and therefore in a state of almost arrested life. How could they be aware what part of the year it was when they were taken out of the container? There's some kind of sentience that all beings and all things have. All things are aware. Everything is aware, including water, including, or you could say everything has memory, or everything has sensitivity to the cosmic environment, the cosmos. Okay? Facts that contradict the theory. Let's see. Clock's 2 days fast. Brown writes, this is another scientist. Brown writes, every living thing studied in our laboratory during the past 3 years, from carrots to seaweed and from crabs and oysters to rats, has shown this capacity to predict very safely beyond chances the barometric pressure change, usually 2 days in advance. So these organisms, these things, these seaweeds, carrots, anything, can sense when the barometric pressure and the weather is going to change. They have the sixth or seventh sense, and they adapt themselves accordingly. So they start to change 2 days in advance before it even happens. 3 years of continuous observation, of potatoes have shown that metabolic activity follows a daily pattern consisting of 3 consumption peaks. One near sunrise, the second at noon, and the third near sunset. Yet variations in light, temperature, or humidity cannot account for these peaks, since all 3 were held constant in the laboratory. Okay, they're changing their metabolic activity in response to when the sun is rising, when the sun is at high noon, and when the sun is setting, without even having any sunlight on them. In a controlled laboratory, they're sensing it. Somehow the information is getting into them through some kind of ether that we don't know, but it's there. Okay, I already mentioned the oysters one. I'll read it again because it's one of the best interesting ones. Brown had some live oysters sent in closed, darkened containers from Long Island Sound to his laboratory in Evanston, 1,000 miles from the sea. When they arrived, he observed their activity by measuring the opening of their valves. At first, the oysters kept to their natural rhythm, opening and closing themselves to the rhythm of the tides washing Long Island Sound. But after about 15 days, Brown noticed that a slippage in the daily rhythm had occurred. The oysters now opened up at the time the tide would have flooded Evanston had the town been on the seashore. That is, when the moon passed over the local meridian. The oysters had abandoned their rhythm tied to actual tides and responded to an exclusively lunar rhythm. They were reset by an unknown influence related to the passage of the moon above the meridian of Evanston. All this while they were shielded in the dark tanks of the laboratory. Genetic knowledge. This one's pretty interesting. Fertilized hens' eggs were placed inside an incubator, and the breathing of the embryos was checked. During the first 5 days of incubation, the embryos showed an average 24-hour variation with peaks related to sunrise, moon, and sunset. I think they meant noon instead of moon. Just as potatoes had. The embryos appeared to be aware of when the sun rose and set, despite the uniform lighting and temperature of their sealed environment. When after a week the chicks had developed their capacity for muscular activity, the breathing apparatus showed that their activity increased when the sun rose and declined when the sun set, in keeping with their inherited diurnal nature. Obviously, the embryo had never seen the sun, yet a genetic knowledge of these celestial bodies' movements, celestial bodies, they're talking about the planets, manifests itself as soon as the embryos are old enough to react to it in a coordinated manner. Somehow, a freaking embryo in an egg is adapted to nature without even being in nature. It just is feeling and sensing somehow some strange vibrations coming from who knows where. From the planets, from the sun, from the moon. Magnetospheric tails. Okay. We only have 1/3 of the book left, I'd say. So now it's going to be... We're almost done, really. But there's a whole bunch of great ones. This is when it gets really good, folks. Okay. Okay. The animal organism would be some kind of a living would be some kind of a living magnetometer. Reacting in the same way as the instrument of the geophysicist. It's reacting like a living magnometer. Okay? From 1959 on, Brown studied with his co-workers the behavior of animals placed in the geomagnetic field according to well-defined orientations. The boldness of these experiments consists in the fact that the geomagnetic field is extremely weak. The biological compass. Okay, Brown, this is the real interesting one. Brown and his colleagues began their studies with a small mollusk called Narcerius, which resembles a slug and lives in puddles on the beach. These animals were chosen because of their slowness. The experimental setting illustrated here. Okay. This is the experiment. The moon's influence on the biological compass. Okay, here's what happened. The mollusks were placed inside a corral containing 2 centimeters of water. Okay, these are the mollusks in the corral. Placed in 2 centimeters of water. They could leave the container through the neck of the corral, but only one at a time. As they left the enclosure, a fan-shaped indicator permitted the experimenter to measure the angle of the direction taken by the animal in leaving its prison. In this fashion, the exits of 33,000 Narcerius were observed. 33,000. Some of the slugs turned left, some right, some continued straight ahead. When the researchers submitted the pattern of exit orientation to mathematical analysis, they found that the direction in which the Narcerius turns upon leaving depends on the time of day. In the morning, the mollusks usually turn right. At other times, they turn left more often. Certain components of terrestrial magnetism also change in the course of the day. Continuing their experiments through the summer of 1959, Brown and his associates discovered that the mollusk's rhythm of orientation is affected by the phase of the lunar month, just as the sensitive registering needle of the geophysicist is. Okay, these mollusks were in a lab, and somehow they're sensing and going out of their corral in different directions based on what the moon is doing. A later experiment conducted with small freshwater worms called planaria produced similar results. The flatworm was influenced by the phases of the moon. At the new moon, it turned on the average 10 degrees left of the north. while at the full moon it turned the same distance to the right. Other organisms also show an extraordinary sensitivity to magnetism. In Germany, G. Becker has shown that insects such as flies do not land in a chance direction, but align themselves along certain lines of terrestrial magnetic force. The explanation given by Jägli in 1947 for the return of pigeons in terms of magnetic lines has lately been reformulated on a new basis. It now appears that pigeons are indeed equipped with extraordinary sensitivity to magnetism. This is how they orient themselves and migrate properly. Magnetism is not the only additional sense that has been recently found to exist in animals. There are others that enable the organism to receive hitherto unknown messages from space. Animals are also sensible to the whole gamut of electromagnetic waves. One of their characteristics is that nothing can stop them. Okay, so we're talking about the waves, the electromagnetic waves. One of their characteristics is that nothing can stop them, not even the thickest walls. Another is that they depend on cosmic phenomena. Both the rising of the sun and solar eruptions cause an abundance of such waves. Seeds, bacteria, and insects seem to know this and regulate their vital rhythms accordingly. This is interesting. Confined in a container with opaque sides, a swarm of the insects reacted to, we're talking about insects now, reacted to the invisible approach of a mass of lead weighing 80 pounds or more. Such a reaction is still difficult to explain. The insect may have an ultra-optic perception of gravitation that permits it to follow the movements of the sun and the moon and set its biological clock by them. Okay, it's sensing a large object in its vicinity, a mass of lead. Somehow they can't see it, but they're sensing it. Okay, lead gives off a certain magnetism, a certain gravity, etc. Scientists have begun to accept the idea until recently unbelievable that the influence of space penetrate everywhere, including the best protected laboratories, affecting all organisms, even those placed in apparently uniform conditions. In fact, the results show that there are no truly uniform conditions on Earth. Objective science. M. Valot, in his laboratory on Mont Blanc, recorded the passage of sunspots. At the same time, we're talking about the unknown senses of man is this chapter. Okay, we're almost done here, but there's great stuff to come. Recorded the passage of sunspots. At the same time, Dr. Sardou recorded the cases of sickness he observed at Nice. Nice is a place on the Mediterranean shore. While I recorded those at Lamalou, a station in the Cevennes Hills on the borders of the central plateau of France. I'm sure it's pronounced differently, but whatever. Our observations were not relayed to each other, but when we matched our results after 267 days of continuous observations, it was easy to see that they were in a chronological sequence. That is, the 25 transitions of sunspots were followed 21 times by a clear incidence of morbidity. Morbidity means death. Morbid. Basically. Later I noticed that the number of sudden deaths during the passage of sunspots was twice as high as at any other time. Okay, when sunspots are real high, that means when there's a lot of solar activity going on, a lot of explosions on the sun, there's more deaths. Another study here. The study he produced was a truly panoramic view of history in which he correlated the curves of solar activity with wars, revolutions, and migrations all the way from 500 BC to the year 1900. They're talking about this guy, Chajevsky. He concluded the analysis, that's 500 BC to the year 1900. Come on. He concluded The analysis of his results by noting that psychic epidemics coincided with solar activity peaks 72% of the time, and with troughs in solar activity. Troughs are like, slow periods. In solar activity, only 28% of the time. For Chajevsky, even the immigration of Jews into the United States followed a cosmic determinism. Just as the alternation of liberal and conservative cabinets in England did. In the century between 1830 and 1930, the liberals are supposed to have been in power during sunspot peaks, and the conservatives when sunspots were scarce. So even relating to politics here. Conservatives when there's less sunspots, liberals when there's a lot of sunspots. According to Chajevsky, solar activity facilitates unrest, and it is this unrest that caused the Jews to try a new life across the sea and encourage the English electorate to support less traditional candidates. Okay, this guy, Takada, Maki Takada. Takada's reaction index. Takada's reaction gives an index for its flocculation, its propensity. They're talking about blood, okay? There's this test that this guy came up with called the Takada reaction. It involves the chemical testing of albumin in blood serum. Albumin is a protein that's in blood serum. Albumin is an organic colloid. Takada's reaction gives an index for its flocculation, its propensity for curdling into small, tufty lumps. It's a delicate method to carry through. First, the blood is taken and processed. Then a reagent that stimulates flocculation is added to it. If little reagent is needed for flocculation to begin, it is said that the flocculation index is high. When much reagent is needed, the index is low. Okay, we're talking about human blood serum now. We're getting into the human stuff here. It's coming. We're going to talk about some medical stuff. White blood cells, things of that nature. For 20 years, the Japanese biologist continued collecting observations. His experiments show, in fact, that the changes in the serum occur in particular when a group of sunspots passes across the central meridian of the sun. That is, when the sun directs a concentrated beam of waves and particles towards Earth. The amazing fact is that the increase of the curve begins a few minutes before sunrise, as if the blood somehow foresees the appearance of the sun. Crazy. To assure himself that the effects he observed were due to solar radiation, he decided to see what happened. I'm paraphrasing all of this, and I'm picking out parts, so go read it if you want all the details. To assure himself that the effects he observed were due to solar radiation, he decided to see what happened when an experiment was performed above the protective atmospheric screen that isolates us from much of the sun's activity. In an airplane, he flew to an altitude of above 30,000 feet with a volunteer from whom a sample of blood was taken every 15 minutes to check the effect of varying altitude. As predicted, the flocculation index rose spectacularly as the plane rose, and the atmospheric shield became thinner, confirming the role of solar radiation in this matter. Then the Japanese biologist asked himself another question. Wouldn't the moon eliminate the effect during eclipses by placing itself between the sun and the earth? 3 times in 1941, 1943, and 1948, these are rigorous scientists. Rigorous. Takada was able to bring subjects and equipment to areas in Japan where there was a total eclipse, and each time he verified his hypothesis. As the moon began to cover the face of the sun, the flocculation index started to decline, reaching its lowest point when the eclipse was complete. The solar radiation that accounts for the Takata effect is apparently deflected by the moon. Okay, so blood clumping up apparently is affected by solar radiation, is what he's saying, and the amount of activity on the sun. Less activity versus more activity. The more activity, the greater or lesser the flocculation index, etc. Flocculation is that clumping of the blood. Man is a living sundial. Okay, the recent work of a Soviet hematologist, Nicholas Scholz. I find it interesting that people in the medical field are often named Nicholas or have certain letters, N's and C's and my name's Collin. Nicholas. Collin is Nicholas is the ancient French version of Colin, if you can believe that. And it's the same letters, really. So, same sounds. It's just the letters flipped backwards and whatnot. With Scholz's work, Nicholas Scholz, hematologist, with his work we leave the uncertain history of pioneering efforts and enter the well-charted era of perfectly verified scientific research. The results of his work from 1954 on were published by Scholz in the 1960 reports of the USSR Academy of Sciences. They were based on more than 120,000 measurements taken at Sochi, a resort on the shores of the Black Sea. Scholz concluded that the vagaries of the solar clock modify the lymphocytic ratio of the blood considerably. Lymphocytic, your lymph nodes, lymph system, your immune system. An almost perfect parallel was found between the percentage of lymphocytes and the sunspot frequencies posted each month by the astronomical observatories. Sometimes a disease results from a deficit of certain blood components. During the great solar explosions of February 1956, blood analyses conducted throughout the Soviet Union showed a marked rise in leukopenia, or abnormal decrease in certain white blood cells. Decrease in white blood cells in response to solar eruptions. Before the solar eruption, the percentage of leukopenics, those with less than 5,000 leukocytes per cubic millimeter of blood, was 14% of the population. After the eruption, the percentage doubled to 29%. 1 month later, in March, it was back to 13%. By July, it was 12%, and by October, it was 11%. Solar activity was therefore able to explain something previously inexplicable. Okay? Effects on the nervous system. I'm going to skip a couple here. Tuberculosis, myocardium, basically respiratory ailments on days of strong solar activity are worse. Okay. Effects on the nervous system. Dr. Martin, his data are based on 306 working days, which accounted for 5,580 accidents. Okay, studying accidents in coal mines. The miners had significantly more accidents on days following solar eruptions. Days on which the sun was quiet were followed by a decrease in the number of accidents. The Duels have also produced, I guess those are some kind of people, or a last name, I don't know, have also produced a study in which they recorded the daily frequencies of suicides and acute mental disorders during a 4-year period. By comparing this frequency curve with the chronology of 67 magnetic storms recorded during the same interval, the authors determined what they thought was a very clear correlation. While the magnetic storms lasted, the number of suicides and mental disturbances increased considerably. Okay, you've heard of the moon making people act crazy, right? And making women more horny, right? Maybe you haven't. Lunacy. Lunar, moon. Lunacy. Lunar, moon. All the same. From the most ancient times, the moon has been charged with having a disturbing influence on mental stability. Lunatic has become a synonym for unruly spirit or madman. As early as the 16th century, writes Dr. Ravitz, Paracelsus claimed that the insane grew worse at the dark of the moon, when the moon's attraction upon the brain was believed to be the strongest. Such beliefs were legalized in 18th century England, at which time a distinction was made between insane, which designated the chronologically and hopelessly psychotic, and lunatic aberrations, which were believed to be exacerbated only by the full moon. Difference between insane and a lunatic. Based on the moon. England. Beliefs were legalized. A Florida surgeon, an ear, nose, and throat man, has found remarkably clear evidence of a moon cycle in bleeding. Reporting in the Journal of Florida Medical Association, Dr. Edson J. Andrews of Tallahassee tells what he found when he plotted cases of excessive post-operative bleeding against the cycles of the moon. Working with more than 1,000 cases and defining bleeders as patients requiring unusual means of hemostasis on the operating table or requiring return to the operating room because of hemorrhaging, he found a sharp difference. It amounted to a great preponderance of bleeders near the time of the full moon and only an insignificant number at the new moon. Okay, we all know about the menstrual cycle related to the moon, 28 days, moon cycle. Same as the moon cycle. The unknown senses of man. Can we sense magnetism? Maybe you're more sensitive if you have a clean, healthy, pure body, if you've detoxed all the junk out of your body that's blocking and calcifying all your organs and your pineal gland and all your sensitive brain organs. The pineal, some people consider an antennae, which is receiving vibrations and which is transmitting vibrations. I have myself become much more sensitive to vibrations over the years of getting much, much healthier, physically healthier. It also, I'm sure, would make somebody more sensitive to things if they, I don't know, let's read the book, okay? All kinds of sensitivity. Some people are more sensitive, some people are less sensitive, okay? Depending on different things. About 40 years ago, for example, the Russian Chizhevsky demonstrated how human behavior and metabolism were affected by ions, electrically charged particles floating in the atmosphere. This was proof of a very fine sensitivity on the part of the human system. Recent investigations by Kruger and Smith and by Kornblue and his collaborators have shown that the body can distinguish between positive and negative ions. The former have generally depressing effect. Okay, positive and negative ions. Why do you think you should walk barefoot on the earth? So you can get a free flowing of negative ions from all the minerals in the earth. They give off negative ions. Those neutralize positive toxins in your body and help you feel more grounded, literally and metaphorically, and just make you feel better. Why do you think you might feel better walking near the ocean? Because of all those negative ions coming off. How about wearing crystals or putting salt lamps around your house? Negative ions, neutralizing positive ions. So positive ions generally have a depressing effect. The latter is a stimulating one. Negative ions, a stimulating effect. Energizing. Physicists have shown that cosmic events affect atmospheric ionization. Thus, their influence on man can be explained through the medium of ionization. Okay, then they talk about how basically anybody can be a dowser and they can detect the weak magnetic gradients. Detect water and things. They did these experiments showing that basically anybody can do it naturally, easily. It just, so we are magnetic beings, and it comes natural to us. We are magnetic beings. We can sense it. It's there. Importance of the month of birth. Basically saying if you're born at certain times, you're healthier. And you have certain build, a body build. So among the people who are now born at the most favorable season, the average duration of life is several years longer than among those born at the least favorable season. This is true even in comparatively good climates like that of the northern United States. The larger men were born in February, summer in the southern hemisphere. So larger people are born in summer, or I guess it depends on where you are. The larger men were born in February, summer in the southern hemisphere, and the smaller ones in June, which is winter down under. The heaviest ones were born in December. Okay, small people born in June, in winter time, I guess. Larger people born in summer, but the heaviest born in December, and then it doesn't specify whether that's winter or summer in which hemisphere for December. So it's kind of interesting, though. Although the difference in weight was relatively less important than the difference in height. Children born in May and June, and also in September and October, have a slightly higher IQ than those born at other seasons. September and October. So that would be Virgos and Virgos and Libras. Slightly higher IQ, basically, than those born at other seasons. Among the 17,000 children whom he investigated, the average intelligence quotient was lowest among those born in January and February. Okay, so that would be Capricorn and Aquarius. Survey, month of birth, 2,090 schizophrenics. Of these, 628 were born during the 3 winter months. More schizophrenics born in the winter months. While only 428 were born in summer, July to September. Interesting. Peak births occur towards the end of the night and at the first hours of the day. Okay, talking about labor. Okay. The hour at which the child is born can also serve to a certain extent as an indication of his future vitality. Dr. Malik finds that natural deliveries begun at the most favorable time, that is around midnight, are the fastest and easiest ones. The 24-hour rhythm, our most powerful time giver, imposes its schedule on the female organism and controls its nervous and hormone activities. This is the nature of the causation that seems to regulate the process of birth. Dr. Menaker collected information on more than 500,000 births that occurred in New York City hospitals between 1948 and 1957. This huge investigation, conducted with the utmost care, allowed them to reach the following conclusion. There are more births during the waning moon than during the waxing moon, with a maximum just after the full moon and a minimum after the new moon. Okay, we're getting to the great stuff. As with animals studied by Brown, the biological clock controlling uterine contractions seemed to be set to the time of the moon's passage overhead. He found an increase of births at the culmination of the moon. Culmination is when the moon's like directly ahead. Okay, that would be midnight. Okay, now we're talking about planets and heredity. What we had observed was that a large number of future great physicians were born when the planets Mars and Saturn had just risen or culminated in the sky. Culmination is when it's at noon, when that planet's basically at mid transit. It's not when the planet's rising or when the planet's setting. It's when the planet is directly, mid transit, directly in the middle. So now they're talking about what you're gonna, your vocation's gonna be based on this stuff. Okay, after the rise or the culmination of Mars and Saturn, an undeniable statistical correlation appeared between the rise and culmination of these planets at the child's birth and his future success as a doctor. Now, one could argue that statistics, you can pick out and find patterns everywhere in anything you want to find and pick if you're looking for it, right? But this is more than statistics. There's other experiments here. This is not all statistics. Eventually, a more and more precise statistical relationship appeared between time of birth and professional career. Okay. As far as vocational success was concerned, the Moon, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn were found to act as planetary clocks. More births of future doctors at certain times, more future artists at others, and so on. Okay, here is the chart. I'm sure you can't see that, but planetary correlations with I'm having trouble with S's today. I don't know why. Probably because I'm trying to speak at 1,000 miles an hour, because I know people don't have the attention span to watch an hour and a half video. I hope you do if you're really interested in astrology, because you're not going to find this video out there. It doesn't exist because nobody knows about this book. Shout out to you, Andrew, for showing it to me. Thanks. Mars. Okay, high frequency of births after rise and culmination of Mars. Culmination, again, is when it's at its peak in the sky. You can think about it as noon for the planet Mars. So when Mars is at the culmination or the rise, when it's rising on the horizon, or when it's culminating, scientists, you're gonna have a high frequency of scientists, physicians, athletes, military men, and businessmen. Okay, when Jupiter is rising and culminating, high frequency of politicians, also military men, actors, journalists, and playwrights. When Saturn is rising or culminating, you have a lot of scientists and physicians. This is when it's rising or culminating at the time of your birth. When the moon is rising or culminating, you have a lot of writers and politicians also. Our work deeply perplexed many astronomers, demographers, and statisticians. After recognizing our conclusions, the scientific community raised a number of pertinent questions that had to be answered. How could classical physics account for the statistical relationship? What interaction is possible between the child being born and the rise or culmination of a given planet? Why would Mars act differently from Jupiter? One possibility. Now they're going to talk about why does this all occur? Classical physics does not understand how this can possibly occur. One possibility is that some form of radiation issuing from the planets marks the newborn at birth with an influence whose effect persists the whole life long. We've already established that these vibrations coming from these planets have an effect. That's one possibility. There's variable levels of sensitivity between humans, probably based on heredity, they're saying here also. Because mice living in identically lighted environments follow different cycles of activity, because, every mouse and every person is different. These vibrations aren't everything. There's many things to think about. Your heredity, your astrology, your numerology, your environment that you grow up in, the place you were born, nurture, nature, there's multiple factors that influence who you become. Challenges in your life, it's not all about astrology, of course. I'm not completely crazy about it, but I'm trying to establish some validity. Because I've found that in my life, astrology and numerology and some of these pseudosciences are extraordinarily accurate for me. And I've studied it very, very deeply. Oftentimes, the people who poo-poo astrology or numerology have never studied it whatsoever. And Newton actually had a quote to Halley, the guy that, Halley's Comet? Halley's Comet? That guy was a scientist. Newton, Halley said some snide remark about astrology, and Newton basically said, I've studied it. Halley, you have not. There's a difference. One possibility is that some form of radiation issuing from the planets marks the newborn at birth with an influence whose effect persists the whole life. Oh, sorry, I already read that. I'm starting to lose my mind at 1 hour and 27 into this. Maybe it's the moon. Each animal had its own way of following the cosmic clock. They concluded that differences may be due to individual genetic heredity. Okay, thus the newborn's heredity, rather than a sudden action emanating from the planets, might account for our findings. So heredity. So the following hypothesis can be proposed. The child inherits from his parents a tendency to be born when Mars rises, in the same way he inherits the color of his hair. In order to confirm the hypothesis, the research had to demonstrate that the child's parents had also shown this tendency. In other words, that they were also born at the time of Mars's appearance. So now we're getting into parents' astrology charts versus their children, and the similarities, and being passed down hereditarily somehow. Only the moon, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn were found at the same place in the sky at birth from one generation to the other. Children have the tendency to be born when one of these bodies rises or culminates, if the same body occupied at the region of the sky at their parents' birth. No hereditary result was obtained from Mercury, which is small and close to the Sun, or for Uranus, Neptune, or Pluto, which are very far removed from the Earth. Okay, so just these 5 visible planets, that the ancients knew, are affecting us more than Mercury because it's so close to the Sun, and more than Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, the farther away ones. So in studying astrology, you might want to look more at those planets and put more emphasis on them than, other lesser planets that are farther away. That their magnetospheric tail is not, far enough to have a big effect on us. The graph expands. There's all kinds of graphs in this book too, which is awesome. So, for the mathematically and scientifically rigorous person, I think this may satisfy you. The graph expands the illustrative model in Figure 8. The Moon, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn tend to occupy positions at the child's birth similar to the ones they occupied when the child's parents were born. Therefore, children are born more often at the rise or culmination of a planet if the same planet was in the same position at their parents' birth. Okay? It's more often the case if there's more often hereditary similarities is twice as high when whatever. Moving on from that one. The hereditary effect of the planets fails to manage. This occurs when the sample consists. When C-sections. The hereditary effect of the planets fails to manifest itself under certain circumstances. This occurs when the sample consists of births that required surgical intervention or were induced by the use of drugs. Such cases do not conform to the pattern expected when births occur naturally. But this, of course, is one of those exceptions that confirm the rule. We're almost done here. I'm going to blow your mind in the end here. Believe you me. Okay, the fluid of life. This is like the final chapters here. And this is it. This is when it gets cray-cray. In theory, when one mixes two chemical substances in a test tube, we're talking about fluids now. If one is careful to use the same method each time, the same reaction will always take place. That's in theory. But this only happens in theory. In reality, each reaction has its idiosyncrasies. Its speed changes from day to day. Sometimes it does not appear at all. All chemists know of such abnormalities, but at least until very recently, they preferred not to talk about them. Picardi writes, chemists have never thought that each hour might not be like every other, but if they have thought so, they have never admitted it. It would have been too dangerous. Although such occurrences are commonplace, admitting them could indeed have dangerous repercussions. It would mean that chemical properties change from one hour to the next without their chemical formulas being changed. Scientists refuse to admit this enormity, which would rock the whole edifice of chemistry on its foundations. Thus, the professor preferred to explain the phenomenon to his lab assistant in terms of chance and aberrant reactions. Quantum physics. Few truths seem more obvious and more certain than the statement that water freezes at 32 degrees Fahrenheit and changes into ice. Actually, this is often untrue. Sometimes the temperature has to be lowered far below 32 degrees before water turns to ice. This reminds me of pyramid power. There were some studies in Germany. They built a pyramid to the specifications of the pyramid in like a smaller version of the Great Pyramid of Giza, same kind of geometry, and they did tests here in Germany. They take this stuff seriously, this voodoo science. And they found many, many things that basically put in a specific geometrical proportion, which is in this pyramid. That if you put certain food in there, it would rot more slowly. Wounds would heal more quickly, and water would freeze at a different temperature than the standard 32 degrees Fahrenheit. I think it took a lower temperature to freeze it, just like in this instance. Some scientists are more curious than others. Around 1950, the German biologist H. Bortels of Berlin University became interested in this phenomenon. He investigated the strange behavior of water, which specialists call surfusion. Also, if you put razor blades in a pyramid structure built to specific geometry, they will actually maintain their sharpness much better because of the magnetism and the electricity and the magnetism. At certain angles that the geometry is creating this electromagnetic frequency, it's hitting these at a certain angle and keeping the blade sharp. He had demonstrated that the causes were not random. They were affected by some well-defined yet mysterious factors. Although samples of pure water were sealed off from any external influence, the surfusion seemed to follow the variations in atmospheric pressure and in the activity of terrestrial magnetism. Terrestrial means on Earth, not, extraterrestrial. How can it be perceived by inorganic compounds? Saying like inorganic compounds can perceive the vibrations. Water leaves... Okay, here's another experiment. We're almost done here, folks. Now, this started to remind me of Dr. Emoto in Japan. Masaru Emoto did experiments on water, showing that they hold certain vibrations. You can influence your water because they will hold memory. They will hold your thoughts, your intentions in them. You can structure water to have beauty and health, and by putting gratitude or putting the word gratitude or love or whatever, the water takes on the structure of that vibration. So amazing stuff. Water leaves calcareous deposits inside containers used to hold it. Housewives have this problem with their cooking pots, and industrial boilers are no exception. Such deposits can seriously affect the functioning of the engines. The water touching the vial ends up activated. Okay, so here's what he did. A vial of glass containing a drop of mercury and low-pressure neon is slowly stirred inside the water. As the container is moved, the mercury rubs against the glass. The double electric layer between the mercury and the glass breaks and produces a red luminescent discharge through the neon. The water touching the vial ends up activated. Okay, so the neon and the mercury are not actually in the water. They're in a vial in the water. And they're activating the water. Activated water not only fails to develop calcareous deposits once it is poured in a boiler, it actually dissolves prior incrustations. Looks like my battery is dying on my computer, so I better hurry up. The water touching the vial, where am I? The chemical composition of the physically treated water remained absolutely identical to normal water. It was indeed like sorcery. A few red lights, a few electrical discharges, and presto, the water acquired miraculous properties. Okay, you can activate water with your thoughts and intentions. Those are vibrations. Everything is a vibration. Just like your name is a vibration, your birth date is a vibration, hence astrology and numerology. Everything is music. Everything is number. Everything is vibration. Because everything gives off magnetism and electricity. When the Earth is bombarded by the effects of such sudden instances of solar ill humor, the reactions inside beakers kept in the open air occur more quickly, while those taking place in beakers shielded by metallic screens do not change. The curve of sunspot frequency is remarkably parallel to the curve of chemical reactions. Water has an odd quality that enables it to react compliantly to external influences. Water is a liquid that still remembers the crystalline form of the ice from which it originates. But you can change that crystalline form based on vibrations. Water studied in the laboratory is as sensitive to very slight changes in electric or magnetic fields as the animals Brown studied. In 1965, two chemists at the University of Florence noticed some differences in the electric conductivity of water that was exposed to the effects of a very small magnet. Okay, we are powerless in the face of external phenomena. Inside the human organism, as well as inside plant and animal organisms, the structure of water readily changes in response to the stimuli of outer space, whether these are waves, particles, or perturbations of a magnetic or of gravitational nature. We're powerless in the face of external phenomena. We cannot prevent the unleashing of a magnetic storm or the eruption of sunspots. We cannot prevent very low-frequency electromagnetic waves from piercing through walls of our laboratories, factories, homes, and bodies. Okay? It's not chance, but a permanent law of nature that makes experiments with liquids difficult to reproduce from one hour to the next. According to Picardi's apt formulation, these are fluctuating phenomena. Is this a reason for giving up the idea of studying them? It should not be. On the contrary, it is necessary to take into account the exact moment at which the reaction occurs. This is almost as important a factor as the chemical means by which the experiment is conducted, because at any given instant the cosmos may act, leaving in its wake an imprint that may change the conditions of the experiment. Amazing. So basically it's saying that we should take into account the exact time that experiments are done, just like the exact time a person's born. Okay, this is the final statement here, and this is going to be the end of the talk, or reading, really, an astrological reading. The sky is not a magic mirror in which our pleasures and pains are reflected, but science does teach us that the whole universe is reflected in a drop of water, that the cosmic rhythms are necessary to the survival of life. Thus we begin to see that our bodies are in fact tied with invisible strings to the cosmos, as was dimly realized in the past. But these strings are not held by planetary gods who make us perform like puppets. They are fields of force known as electricity, magnetism, and gravitation. Dun dun dun. Dun 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 dun. There's some indexes and all kinds of charts in here. Bum bum bum. Tables and charts. This is a great book, folks. I hope I blew your mind on astrology, numerology. If you'd like a consultation, hit me up at collinchi@gmail.com. Check the link in the description below. If you'd like a nutritional consultation, or if you'd like a numerology reading or numerology chart, hit me up, collinchi@gmail.com. Numerology is very similar to astrology somewhat. It's based on Pythagoreanism, Pythagoras. It's based on many different systems. There's Chaldean numerology. I take it all into account, and I can elucidate some insights into your nature and your nurture and what's going on. So I hope this is a pioneering talk, because this is a pioneering book and it's not really out there. I hope this really blazes some trails in astrology research, because this book really does. YouTube probably doesn't have this kind of video out there. I haven't found it, so here it is. I hope you guys enjoyed it. And as always, rise with the sun and the moon.